And now for tonight's presentation. Tonight's speaker completed her graduate work in ornithology and wildlife biology at Cornell in 1978, writing her thesis on the adaptations of hacking techniques to reintroduce bald eagles. Following her studies at Cornell, she worked at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services and the Nature Conservancy for several years, focusing on endangered species and critical habitat conservation before embarking on a 23-year career teaching English and biology. Since her retirement in 2020, she's devoted her time to her writing, especially creating nonfiction with a science or nature focus. 30 years ago, with 4 children in tow, Tina and her husband bought a farm in northern Massachusetts, which they use as a wildlife sanctuary, managing it and promoting biodiversity, habitat protection for species in decline. This evening, at a time where mass extinctions of bird species are a critical global topic, Return to the Sky reminds us how, with a mix of common sense, resilience, and resolve, humans can be effective stewards for the natural world. Please join me in a warm welcome for tonight's speaker, Tina Morris.
Okay. Hopefully everyone can hear me in the back. All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. And you just have no idea what it's like to be sitting up here or standing up here today, because 48 years ago, when I was 27, I stood in front of this group. People were a little different. The room was a lot different. The building was a lot different. And I was a lot different. But I had the same topic. I was trying to tell everybody what we were doing up in Montezuma and a little bit about a new program that had just started. So it seems very weird to me to all of a sudden be here today. Really good, but weird. So I wanted to tell you that it is an honor to be invited to speak to the Cayuga Bird Club about my book, Return to the Sky, the story of the bald eagles I was trying to save almost 50 years ago. Tonight I will be focusing on those eagles and the project that brought them back to the Northeast. If you read the book, you can find out how my life was changed by the program. But for now, the 7 eaglets will take center stage, and just like their spectacular relatives who now range throughout the Northeast, they do this very well. As we sit here in the Lab of Ornithology, this beautiful renovated structure, and listen to the tale that began the eagles' comeback, memories of major characters in their story come flooding back. For many of you, it must seem like yesterday. For others, perhaps, it was a moment in Cornell's history that has faded with time. The 1970s were a decade of magic in bird conservation, and this talk is dedicated to those members of the Peregrine Fund who made it happen. It is also a positive story, which we all probably need to hear today in light of the recent reports of bird decline. There is another reason why it is an honor to speak to you tonight. As many of you know, on Christmas Eve nearly 5 months ago, President Biden signed a bill designating the bald eagle as our national bird. Many of us, including me, had thought it was already our national bird. But a dedicated supporter of the National Eagle Center in Wabasha, Minnesota, Preston Cook, discovered the government had never officially named it as such. With the help of Amy Klobuchar, senator from Minnesota, he was able to convince both houses of Congress, and believe me, that's saying a lot these days, to pass legislation which made it to the president's desk before he was to leave office. We can now accurately refer to the eagle as the nation's bird and have Preston Cook to thank for this effort. The saga of the bald eagle's return was inextricably tied to that of the peregrine falcon. Without its smaller and faster friend to set the pace, the success of the Eagle Project might not have been so auspicious. The raptor biologists who were responsible for the return of the peregrine in 1973 became the central force behind the restoration of the eagle 3 years later. The story of the eagle and peregrine began here in Ithaca. As you all know, Cornell was known for its world-renowned laboratory of ornithology, and by the 1970s, it had also become the epicenter for raptor reintroductions. We need to back up a decade, however, to the seminal event that started everything, In 1962, a marine biologist named Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, the book that sounded the alarm about the lethal effects of the pesticide DDT. At the time, few biologists paid any attention to Carson, partly because of her doomsday predictions and partly because of her gender. Women were scarce in science at the time, which made it easy for the scientific community to dismiss her. It was her findings about DDT, a long-lasting pesticide used to combat malaria in World War II, that made Carson a main character in the bald eagle story. She discovered that DDT wasn't just killing mosquitoes it was meant to control, but it was breaking down into its metabolite DDE, which was absorbed by the algae, fish, and other aquatic organisms consumed by birds. Once ingested, DDE interfered with the calcium metabolism of the bird's eggs, resulting in thinner shells and breakage as soon as the birds tried to incubate them. Although all birds were being affected, the ones most at risk were those at the top of the food chain: ospreys, pelicans, and bald eagles who eat fish, and peregrine falcons who eat smaller birds who were in turn eating insects, seeds, and other food contaminated with the poison. Through a process called biomagnification, the pesticide was consumed by species at each trophic level. Its concentration increased with every step up the food chain until its final and top destination, the predators. Sadly, Rachel Carson died at the age of 56 from cancer, only 2 years after her book was published. But her findings had been corroborated by the U.S. Geological Survey's Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland. The bird world was shocked by the truth that explained the decline of so many of their beloved species. Carson's cause was taken up by a group of people with personal interest in the raptors affected by DDT, particularly peregrine falcons. In 1965, led by a falconer named Joe Hickey, a professor then at the University of Wisconsin, a conference was held in Madison to discuss the problem. At that meeting, the Raptor Research Foundation was born. The 1970s became the age of enlightenment as the federal government took up the cause of environmental degradation. Under Richard Nixon, whose administration, unbeknownst to many, had a strong commitment to the environment, legislation began to be passed to curb our decline. In 1970, Joe Hickey organized a second meeting in Madison, this time to call for the ban of DDT. In December of that year, the EPA was established to be the watchdog for clean air and water. Although DDT wasn't officially banned until 1972, the race was on to save the birds. Preparing the stage further to restore species like the peregrine and eagle was the passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973, protecting not only the species but also their habitat. Let me introduce the fathers of falconry. Although the three men were most instrumental in addressing the plight of peregrines. Tom Cade, who should need no introduction to you, was a falconer and ornithology professor at Syracuse University before he came to Cornell. Heinz Meng, who was mastering the art of captive breeding of falcons at SUNY New Paltz, and of course, Joe Hickey. Although the falconry world was close-knit and everyone helped each other as they considered how to save the peregrine, it was Tom Cade who established the program that would bring it back. He moved from Syracuse to Cornell with a stipulation that he could house a captive breeding facility in Ithaca. Because there were no peregrines left in the Northeast, captive breeding of subspecies from other areas was vital. Dr. Cade created a facility known to the Cornell community as the Hawk Barn, a few meters from where we are sitting right now, but I get a little confused with all the changes in the roads, exactly where the Hawk Barn was, but it's no longer there. The barn was divided into flight cages with nesting ledges to resemble the peregrine's natural eyries. Here the art of artificial insemination was mastered, although excited male falcons forced their handlers to wear some self-defense equipment, like this modified copulation helmet with a lip around it to catch the semen while protecting their heads. The peregrine program used hacking, a training technique borrowed from falconry whereby young birds are raised and released without parents. Sometimes these young falcons can be bred in captivity, and sometimes they're taken from the nest at a young age. In the latter case, the birds have imprinted or identified with their parents. so that they can be mature and live as members of their own species. The Peregrine Falcon program placed young falcons into hacking boxes where they were fed and protected by human caretakers who stayed out of sight as much as possible until they were ready to fly and catch food on their own. The hack boxes were placed in areas that most closely resembled peregrines' natural habitat, such as cliffsides or ledges, towers, and later bridges when the program moved into cities to avoid predators like great horned owls and raccoons. The peregrine releases, begun in 1973, served as the model for the Bald Eagle Project. Having witnessed the success of the Peregrine program, New York State's Department of Environmental Conservation foresaw the year 1976 as an ideal time to bring the eagle back from the brink of extinction. By then, DDT had decimated its populations in all states of the Northeast except for a few pairs still in Maine. Patriotic fever was running high, and nobody could imagine celebrating the bicentennial without what they believed to be at the time their national bird. After its ban in 1972, DDT levels detected in fish declined precipitously. By the mid-1970s, the bald eagle's former habitat had become clean enough to receive birds again. Although almost gone from the sky, the eagle's image was ubiquitous, appearing on our currency, on sports team logos. I'm convinced the Eagles even won the Super Bowl with the eagle logo because the eagle logo was on their helmets. And of course on our national seal, despite Ben Franklin's disdain for the eagle, which he considered a bad moral character, supposedly because of its scavenger nature. The turkey and other contenders didn't stand a chance against the grandeur of the bald eagle when our forefathers had to find a symbol of freedom, majesty, and power to represent the newly independent USA. By 1976, in the lower 48 states, eagles had been reduced to 417 pairs, a number too low to sustain the species. According to the terms of the Endangered Species Act, the federal government had jurisdiction over the bald eagle, so New York needed permission from the Department of the Interior in Washington, D.C. to launch a reintroduction program. DEC's proposal to release eagles was denied due to the state agency not having any raptor biologists on staff that could lead the program. Enter Tom Cade and his young and inexperienced wannabe graduate student, me. I had arrived at Cornell to pursue my dream to work with Dr. Cade, but when he told me I needed a funded program to be accepted as one of his students, my dream started to plummet. Then, by pure serendipity, I had a chance meeting with the two Fish and Wildlife administrators in Washington in charge of the defunct eagle proposal, and things took a sudden turn. They asked Tom Cade to head the program for eagles due to his expertise with reintroducing peregrines. If I would be willing to work with the eagles, Dr. Cade said, he would agree to supervise the project, and the eagle program would be possible. A deal was made, the project began, officially in June 1976, but the groundwork began to be laid the previous fall. The first order of business was to find a suitable site in New York from which to reintroduce the birds. Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge near Seneca Falls at the northern end of Cayuga Lake was selected. Montezuma met all the requirements needed for a release site. Food would be plentiful in the 10,000-acre wetland complex where marsh, rivers, and open water were prevalent. The presence of a wide variety of water birds and fish guaranteed its food potential for young bald eagles as well as adults returning eventually to breed. Protection of the young eagles was paramount, so the release site had to be able to be cordoned off and made inaccessible to the public. Clark's Ridge, a hilltop overlooking Shockey Pool, the largest water body in the marsh, was hidden amidst a labyrinth of dirt roads that traverse farmland around the refuge, making it impossible to locate it. Luckily, this was before the days of GPS and Google Maps. It was important that the site be near Cornell, so the Peregrine team could be available for emergencies in case I needed them. The drive from Ithaca to the refuge took less than an hour. Bald eagles prefer to nest in tall trees with strong branches which the young use as practice perches when they're learning to fly. Nests are often built in the V formed by these branches. The adults like to be able to see around them, so height and being on the edge of the forest is important. Montezuma had many hardwoods surrounding the wetland areas, perfect for future nests. Once the site was chosen, the next dilemma was finding a source for young eaglets that could be transported to New York. Because there was no sustainable population left in any of the surrounding states, it would be necessary to go further afield to find an area where DDT hadn't left its mark. Alaska had plenty of eagles, but the genetic makeup of this larger subspecies was thought to be too different to take a chance on. Instead, the program looked to the Midwest, particularly the Great Lakes states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota, where DDT hadn't been used as it had in the Northeast, and where a healthy population of bald eagles could be found. Bald eagles generally lay 3 eggs and try to rear 3 young. However, because of food supply and energy expenditure, that third eaglet is smaller and weaker than its siblings and often doesn't make it. They are either thrown from the nest or pushed aside by their stronger ones until they starve. Therefore, the plan was to select the third eaglet from these 3 bird nests for transport. When the climbers scaled the nest trees to band the young eaglets at about 7 weeks of age, it was up to them to determine which birds to remove. The position of the nest tower in the refuge was critical. Not only did it have to be hidden from the public, it had to be high enough for the young birds to survey the land around them, near tall trees they could use as perches once they started to fly, and most of all near the water. Clark's Ridge met all of these criteria. The local electric company donated and installed 4 35-foot high poles for the tower, on top of which we constructed a 7-foot platform. My Peregrine team colleagues, Jim Weaver and Willard Heck, and I had to think like eagle parents and build a nest for them closely resembling the nest where they had come from. The next step was to create a canvas blind or hide next to the platform so I could observe and feed the eagles without them seeing me. The blind was barely large enough for me to sit in cross-legged. On the side facing the nest was a hole through which I could feed the eagles using a long barbecue fork, without having them see me, so they wouldn't view humans as their providers or food source, a dangerous situation for both species. At first, I had to climb up the platform using metal pegs like those used by electric linemen. But once the scaffolding was up, my ascent became far easier and a bit less scary. We wrapped aluminum predator guards around the poles to prevent animals like raccoons from reaching the vulnerable young birds. The day finally came on June 18, 1976, when Wisconsin Fish and Wildlife climbers called to say they had 2 eaglets ready to ship to New York. Arriving at Syracuse Airport in 2 separate crates, the birds known as W1 and W2, W for Wisconsin, 1 for female, 2 for the male, were retrieved by federal officials and driven to the refuge an hour away. On hand to receive the eaglets was a large contingent of state, federal, and refuge officials, a few biologists from Cornell, Tom Cade, me, and my 2 dogs, Max and Moses. While most of the entourage stood at the base of the tower looking up, Dr. Cade tied the ropes around the crates. You can see him over there on the left. Jim Weaver hauled them up to the top of the tower, and Dr. Cade and I then pried open the tops and released them. The eaglets had been shrieking while in the crates with their call-like cry until they were able to jump onto their new nest and retreat to the corner of the platform as far away from their captors as possible. These weren't cuddly, tame birds who wanted to be our friends, and for that we were all very grateful. They had to have a healthy fear of humans if they were to survive. After the eaglets settled down and the crowd dispersed, I was left alone on the hillside with my dogs, wondering how on earth the eagles and I were going to survive the next 3 months. The first order of business was to set up my campsite, including my tent, camp stove, and all the paraphernalia required for the eagles. To observe the birds, even when I wasn't up in the blind, I had a remote video camera with a monitor in the tent. The picture was a bit fuzzy by modern standards, but at least I could see they were okay. Many of you have experienced more advanced technology if you've been looking at eagle cams, especially in Big Bear Valley, California, where thousands of viewers focused on the pair, Jackie and Shadow, hatching eggs after 2 years of failure. The images are so clear, you feel like you are in the nest with the birds. That was not the case here. The next order of business was to feed the young birds. The marshes were teeming with carp, but I had to catch them and stockpile them so they would be available for 2 meals a day. In the first year, fish were plentiful and I trapped them in a spillway. Then I moved them into a large cage in the water where I could net them whenever I needed them. In the next year, however, a severe drought decimated the marsh and the carp died, and I had to enlist the help of local fishermen to restock my supply. Eagles are opportunistic feeders, as many of you know, so although fish is a mainstay of their diet, they also eat small mammals and water birds, as well as scavenge for carrion. To give them a balanced diet and introduce them to the varied prey items and delicacies that awaited them in the real world, I had to find roadkill. I spent hours driving the roads around the refuge, picking up rabbits, squirrels, muskrats, woodchucks, snakes, and other tasty morsels. By the way, rabbits were the food of choice. I knew we had to be able to track the eaglets when they left the nest, so banding and equipping them with radios became the next step before they fledged. Surveillance methods, especially for eagles, were in their infancy in 1976, so everything we did was trial and error. With Jim Weaver's help and experience and lots of experimenting, we eventually worked out how to attach a short-term radio to the eagles and to put colored tags on their wings that could withstand the weather and also be seen from a distance. Because of their dependence on flight for hunting and migration, it was essential to ensure these apparatuses not interfere with their wing movement. We had to modify things, but from 1976 to 1977, once we figured out what worked best. My issue was going to be restraining the eagles, especially when I had to handle them alone, which was a lot of the time. For this, I experimented with several body wraps, but what worked best in the end, believe it or not, was my blue jeans. I cut off the leg, and its tapering shape was a perfect fit for an eagle. He couldn't move his wings, and with his talons wrapped with electrical tape and his beak unable to reach my hands, he was safe and secure, as was I. After spending my days watching and recording the eaglets' behavior from the blind, I noticed a significant increase in their energy level. Increasingly more restless, they began hopping all over the platform, flapping their wings as they practiced their pre-flight maneuvers, and even banging their heads on the top of the enclosure as they gained altitude. It was finally time to remove the bars and let them out on the perch that we had nailed to the tower before they hurt themselves. Before long, they made their first flight. I had little time to celebrate as they spread their wings for the first time. Like all young creatures, first steps, or in this case, flights, are a bit shaky. An eagle's size works against it when first taking off, so it looks like an out-of-control helicopter looking for a landing place. This usually was into the marsh far below the hillside, its thick cattail stands interspersed with pools of water. Without wind to help with lift, the young eagles couldn't become elevated, so were stuck. If they'd had parents, they would have fed them on the ground and watched over them until their wings were stronger. But it was up to me to find them, catch them, and return them to their nest on top of the tower for a second try. I have to admit, hauling a struggling eagle under one arm while gripping the ladder with the other was never an easy task. Eventually, they grew stronger and were able to reach a perch, either on one of the trees near the nest or the dead snags in the marsh. The 1976 eaglets spent a few months exploring the areas inside and outside the refuge, learning how to catch their own food, until hunting season in October. Then they left the refuge for good, leaving me to wonder if they would survive all the threats that awaited them in the outside world. Once their radio batteries died, there was no way to follow them, so all I could do was hope. In late winter and spring of 1977, we began to prepare for the next group of eagles. The decision to hack 4 birds had been made. The scaffolding had to be removed so a second nest platform could be built. The blind was placed between the 2 nests so I could observe and feed both sets of eagles. With the scaffolding gone, I was back to the metal pegs. And like an aspiring mountain goat, I would clamber up the platform, push aside the plywood door to my blind, and haul myself inside, all while trying not to make a sound that would disturb the birds. In the photo on the left, you can see my blue jean cut-off shorts, whose legs were now in use as the sleeves to restrain the eagles. I went through the whole summer with shorts. In 1977, 2 of our eaglets were taken from 3 bird nests, one from Michigan, M1, and one from Minnesota, M2. But we also wanted to use captive bred birds for the first time. Patuxent Wildlife Research Center offered us 2 eaglets raised by eagle parents held in captivity there. There turned out to be a huge difference between the captive bred young and the wild young, partly because of size and maturity of the captive bred birds. They had been fed an unlimited diet at Patuxent. They had become used to people and were feistier and more precocious than the wild birds. They had no desire to be contained behind bars and went out to the perch early after arriving. Sometimes they hopped onto the roof for a better view. The video camera had been moved to a pole next to the nest tower so it could capture both nests and record their activity back to the monitor in the tent. In July, a game of musical chairs was in order. All 4 eaglets were still confined in their nests when I received word that I would be welcoming a new arrival. A 3rd eaglet with a broken leg had been discovered by the climbers in Michigan when they were securing our eaglet M1. The injured bird, whom I called M3, was sent to the vet college of the University of Minnesota, where he was treated and rehabbed. He was now ready to be released and was on his way to me. Since the 2 Patuxent birds in M1, the female from Michigan, were ready to fledge, I opened the bars on the cage so that they could come and go. In the other cage, I put M3 in with M2, the male from Minnesota. We will hear about M3 later in this talk, but for now, suffice to say he was the calmest and most endearing of all the birds I cared for. The secrecy surrounding the Eagle Project was well kept during the first year. Everyone was worried about vandalism if the public knew the eagles were on the ridge, and there was a little bit of worry about me being alone with only my dogs for protection in the middle of nowhere. There was also uncertainty about whether the program would succeed, and the government folks didn't want it advertised until they were sure that the eagles would survive long enough to leave the refuge. In 1977, such secrecy was abandoned, and I was besieged by media, anxious for a juicy story. Reporters would come for an interview, armed with their cameras, and I would find a simple snapshot used to lure readers to a front-page article on the cover of the New York Times about the birds and their young female caretaker. My camera-shy nature was not well suited to this new role I found myself in. Some of the notoriety was welcome, however. In the fall of 1977, I was invited to attend the New York State Fair in Syracuse to be inducted into the Iroquois Confederacy as an honorary member of the Iroquois Nation. Although I was nervous about going, it was a memory that I will savor forever. I spent the day with members of the 6 nations of the Iroquois, learned about their customs and culture, and I was lavished with handmade gifts from each group, including a sacred eagle feather. Apparently, I was the first female to receive such an honor, allowing the wives of the chiefs to be part of the event, an historic moment for them as well. After the eagles left the refuge in the fall of 1977, my tenure as the eagle caretaker was over. Although I never saw these eagles catch their own food, they seemed to be independent and had stopped coming back to the tower for the fish that I left for them, a sure sign they'd found a better option for themselves. I returned to Ithaca and completed my thesis, which became the manual on hacking bald eagles. By the 1980s, 9 other states had adopted our hacking procedures and were releasing eagles. The last state to do so was Tennessee, which hacked birds until 2020, exceeding even New York's total of 198. New York continued to hack eagles in Montezuma from 78 to 81, deciding eventually to move the project to other sites within the state to allow for breeding birds to return to their natal area without becoming overcrowded. As it turned out, eagles aren't as averse to nesting near each other as we had previously thought, as long as there is an ample food supply, which explains today's existence of 28 active nests within a 25-mile radius of Montezuma. As the hacking projects increased, the states had to reach further afield to find healthy eaglets for transport. While New York and several other states were using Alaskan birds by then, deciding the genetic differences wouldn't be a problem, Other states like Pennsylvania and New Jersey connected with Saskatchewan and other Canadian provinces. Massachusetts, my home state, brought in eaglets from Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. This cross-border cooperation between our two countries allowed many eagles to return to the skies of the northeastern U.S. Looking at New England and New York, we can see the dramatic increase in breeding eagle pairs since 1967, when DDT was still a threat. Only Maine had breeding pairs, and just 21 at the time. By 2023, Maine still won the prize with over 800 pairs, with New York a close second, with 426. Circling back to Montezuma for a minute, and the 7 eaglets that I had raised back in 1976 and 1977, my Wisconsin eaglets, W1 and W2, turned out to be siblings taken from the same nest. Their bond never wavered after they left the refuge, and they went on to mate and nest near Watertown, a couple of hours away, raising 1 eaglet in 1980. But the most exciting news was that of M3, the rehabbed eagle from Michigan. I had lost track of him, along with the other eagles from that year, and could only hope that he had survived. In June 2015, I received a press release from DEC of New York that his body had been recovered, the victim of a vehicle hit. He had a band on his leg that identified him as one of my 1977 eagles. He was 38 years old, the oldest wild eagle ever known to exist, and had been nesting at Hemlock Lake, the last remaining eagle nest, when the project was begun. Breeding for 35 years with 2 different mates, he could have produced as many as 70 eaglets during his lifetime. I was indeed a proud mama. 2 other eagles, hacked by DEC later on, had also been identified as part of the famous trio, a family of 2 males and 1 female who returned to nest in the refuge in 1987. New York's goal was to put 10 breeding pairs back into the skies. These maps of nesting territories every 10 years show how successful eagles became at surpassing this goal. Today in the continental U.S., eagles are most numerous in the Midwest and along the Atlantic Flyway. Minnesota has the 2nd largest population, Florida the 3rd, next to Alaska, which boasts about half of the total bald eagle breeding population. The timeline of the bald eagle's recovery is defined by several key pieces of legislation and moments in the U.S. history of conservation, beginning in 1940 with the Bald Eagle Protection Act. By 2007, the eagles had recovered enough to be removed from the endangered species list, although states like Tennessee were still hacking them back to the wild for 13 more years. After 1977, I never returned to Montezuma, although I passed it on the thruway and always craned my neck searching for the tower on Clark's Ridge. I followed the news about the hacked eagles as best I could, but once Dr. Cade moved the Peregrine Fund to Boise, Idaho, merging it with the World Center for Birds of Prey, my source of information was gone. In 2019, Tom Cade died, and by 2020, I felt the story about the origins of this project needed to be told. I knew this meant returning to the marshes to see the eagles again. In November 2022, my husband Larry and I were shocked when we drove into the refuge. When I had left almost 45 years before, there were no nesting eagles, and little sign that the species would become the signature species of the refuge. Now we passed many images of eagles welcoming visitors. After I convinced the current refuge staff that I had been the one to start the program, thanks to the expertise of the Cornell Peregrine Fund and Tom Cade, I was given the keys to the city, or refuge as it were. I was shown the giant sculpture, designed by Jay Seaman for the 40th anniversary of the reintroduction program, that sits on the edge of the refuge adjacent to the New York Thruway. I'm sure many of you have seen it. Accompanied by our Montezuma guides, we bushwhacked our way up to Clark's Ridge, long overgrown but still the home of the nest tower, albeit a bit bedraggled all these years later. Even the box holding the video camera was still intact. I went down memory lane with my patient listeners as they heard about the project, the start of the eagle recovery, and the role Cornell had played in its design. Today, 7 bald eagle nests are active in the refuge, with 9 more in the wetlands complex surrounding the boundaries. Some pairs even build 2 nests, perhaps as insurance against disaster, but I like to think they're feeling so secure and comfortable they want a winter and a summer house. As we stood on the dike road that runs along Shockey Pool, where I had once rescued so many youngsters from the cattails, adult and immature eagles were flying all around us. Here I would like to share what was racing through my mind at this time by reading a short passage from the book about this experience. Several eagles fly over my head toward a group of red maples hugging the inner tributary. Adults land on tree limbs overhanging the dike road, while the immatures, 6 altogether, with their uniforms of chocolate brown from head to toe, perch like preschoolers in one of 2 adjacent trees. I want to call the class to order, to watch and listen and tell them where they have come from and what it means for them to be here on this day. I want to tell them about their grandparents, those stalwart 7 eagles, and the others who followed them, whose resilience and persistence paved the way for their return to this refuge nearly 50 years ago. I want to stand there alone with my birds until they can grasp their own significance. The water is high, the current swift. It would be impossible to cross to the field of cattails in the distance without a boat. It would be at least chest high and require waders to navigate it. But I know it is possible. In this mass of vegetation, interspersed with standing pools of water, invisible from the outside world, had once been 7 hapless eaglets, each rescued from certain disaster by a young researcher so desperate to reach her quarry she didn't notice how deep the water was, how thick the grasses were, how many times she'd fall into the cavities below her. Had that really happened? Surely the river today must be wider, deeper, the Erie Canal forcing manipulation of the water levels over the years. As I begin to question my memories, seeking clarification at every step of my mind travel, I look up at the hillside. My hillside. Nothing but trees can be seen from down here on the dark road, but wait, there is a shadow behind the tallest ones, a bare silhouette of telephone poles, straighter and darker than trees. Something is there, but I can't be sure. Although my heart is gladdened by the sight of so many bald eagles today, I know that their success in increased numbers haven't been without criticism. Many people don't like having predators in their world, or don't understand that an ecosystem is most healthy when every trophic level is full and balanced. An apex predator like a bald eagle can have enemies among humans who find it hard to watch him take a fish from an osprey, or attack its chicks, or take over its platform, or harass loons or herons who are nesting in their lake. Making room for all species is not something we humans do easily. Instead, we pick sides, and often the underdog becomes our cause. We have forgotten that almost 50 years ago, the bald eagle was the underdog, and only with our help and vigilance was saved from extinction. I hope we can learn to champion its comeback, to be tolerant when he behaves according to his true nature, and to ensure the threats that still exist in his world are mitigated so as not to repeat the damage of DDT. And there are significant threats to the eagle we have to be concerned about. Lead poisoning results from lead shot used by hunters that drops into the mud of streams, lakes, and rivers, or is inside the carcasses of waterfowl or deer that are taken by the eagles for dinner. It can also come from lead sinkers used in fishing. Lead wreaks havoc on an eagle's nervous and digestive systems, causing him to lose weight and eventually die. Shooting continues to be an issue, as do vehicle deaths. M3 was testament to this. Eagles are scavengers, so a roadkill or carcass on train tracks are too enticing for a hungry eagle who will arrive to eat dinner and be hit. AVM, or avian vacuolar myelopathy, is caused by a toxin in cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, that transfers to eagles through waterbirds like coots. Wind farms, although a positive resource to counter our use of fossil fuels, can also take out eagles, especially when they are built near their nesting sites. Immatures, as we have learned, aren't coordinated enough to avoid the giant blades when learning to fly. Other threats like rodenticides used by homeowners, businesses, and farmers are lethal to eagles who ingest the targeted rodents unwittingly looking for an easy meal. The more insidious threats of habitat loss, which often reduces nest sites by logging or thinning of tall trees, or development of lake shores and rivers, and, of course, climate change, which affects the food supply the eagle depends on. And our latest and perhaps most serious worry, avian flu, which has taken its toll on many eagles, especially in coastal states like Georgia and Florida, where eagles eat water birds infected with the disease, but also in former eagle strongholds like Michigan and Minnesota. It is believed that this virus killed 600 eagles in 45 states in the last few years. Migrating flocks of snow geese usually winter along the Atlantic coast from New Jersey to South Carolina. On their way south from their breeding grounds in Canada and Greenland, they follow the Atlantic Flyway down the Connecticut River Valley, along the Hudson River in New York, and then through Pennsylvania on their way south. This year, thousands of geese succumbed to the avian flu virus in eastern Pennsylvania, and at least 1,000 were found dead in New York. Alarmingly, snow geese are a favorite prey item of bald eagles. This bird is too majestic to be ignored again, but as we have seen with many less charismatic birds, if we take our eye off the ball, we lose the brilliant biodiversity we need to make our planet survive. The Bald Eagle Project was a success, its recovery extraordinary, and the lessons we have learned should be enduring. We humans owe a debt to the natural world around us. We need to respect it, conserve it, and be mindful of its future. I hope you can read Return to the Sky, if you haven't already done so, but most important, that you are able to enjoy the many bald eagles who have made New York their home. Today we can revel in the numbers of wintering birds who visit the Finger Lakes region, as well as the many nests that can be spotted throughout the state during their breeding season. Thank you all for listening tonight. I would be happy to answer any questions you may have, but knowing how much knowledge is within this room, I emphasize the word try. So be kind. Thank you very much. Yes, Diane.
So I hadn't realized that DDT was used more in the East than in the Midwest. And why is that?
Well, it was mostly used in areas of agriculture. In the Northeast, it was used for agriculture as well. But it was also very prevalent in the Midwest, but lower than the Great Lakes. So sort of the middle states had a lot of DDT in them. So yeah, people think it was just the Northeast, but actually it was used in other places as well. They basically were spraying it wherever there were problems with pests. So in the Northeast, it was mosquitoes. In the Mid-Atlantic, or not the Mid-Atlantic, but the middle states, it was other pests that were eating the crops. So, well, I've intimidated you all with the question. Yes.
So you mentioned those temporary radio tags. How are they designed to be temporary?
You mean the patagial tags we put on their wings?
Yeah.
Well, they weren't really temporary. They were going to eventually rot and drop off. So our idea was that they would last for a few years. The only thing that was really temporary were the radios. And that was because if you put a radio on an eagle, you don't want it to last forever. And the batteries that we had then, I mean, we didn't have much technology. So the batteries we had then literally were 3 weeks, and then they were gone. So now I've read that eagles can be followed for 3 years, and they've managed to get the battery size for a 3-year battery back in '76 would have been about like this. So we couldn't do that. But the patagial tags were not really designed to fall off. The idea was that if the eagle went far afield, that they would be able to be recognized. And the idea behind our constant changing things was to get them so that they weren't interfering with the bird's wings. So if it was lasting, it turned out they lasted a few years, and then they would eventually rot and drop off. They were made out of a vinyl kind of substance called herculite, and it does definitely have a limited lifespan. Yeah.
You said the first year you were out there doing the hacking, everything was secret and nobody knew
Right,
what it were.
yeah.
How did they find out the second year that you were there and that media coverage?
By then, DEC wanted to publicize it, so they did. They put it in all the newspapers and they publicized it, and they got the reporters to come out and interview me. So,
Why did they want to publicize it?
well, it was a highly political program, and they were trying to form their endangered species unit at that time, and the bald eagle was kind of going to be the main character of the endangered species unit. So I think that the officials at DEC decided that it was time to get the name out there and have everybody know that they were doing something good so that they could get funding for the endangered species unit. They needed federal funds. The state didn't have its own money to be able to fund that, so they wanted people to understand that this was something important, and the endangered species unit took off after that. It wasn't just the bald eagle, but they were saving a lot of other animals as well, so it was a very successful program. But in the beginning, I think they just weren't sure it was going to work. And so they really didn't they were worried about the kidnapping part, not me, the eagles. Nobody was really worried about me, I don't know why. But yeah, they were worried about the eagles being taken or somehow people finding out and vandalism and everything else. But by the time this first year had gone by and it was proven the eagles could survive and they left the refuge and they seemed to be doing fine, then I think they thought it was safe to let everybody know that another program was going on. Yeah. Yeah.
At dinner you mentioned that you had been an anthropology major
Hmm.
and decided that you were very interested in raptors. So could you talk a little bit more about how you connected to
How did I get there?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, but it'll be short. I was scared to death of science. I was pre-med in the beginning of college, and I just couldn't stand being in a laboratory. It was just too confining. I liked being outdoors. I'd always been with animals and doing things outdoors when I was a kid. And all of a sudden I found myself looking through a microscope for all those science classes, and I couldn't do it. And so I said, okay, science is gone, pre-med is gone, everything else is gone. I'm going to have to major in something that just sounds like it would be really interesting. So I picked anthropology. And when I graduated from college, somebody took me on a bird walk. And it's interesting for me to hear how many bird walks are going on here, especially with young people. And that's what I needed. I needed a Cayuga bird club. But I didn't have one, and I didn't understand that birds were as fascinating as they were. So I said, this is what I'd like to do. I want to work with animals, and maybe it's possible to work with animals outside. I don't have to be a vet, and I don't have to look through the microscope. So I got a job in a zoo. And at the zoo, I was introduced to the idea of protecting the animals in the wild and not having them in cages, because that motivates you a lot to get the animal out of the cage. And I started really being interested in birds of prey, and I would spend every lunch hour in the library. And who would I be reading about? Tom Cade and his peregrines. And I decided that after a year of working in the zoo that I had to get myself to Cornell. And I would just take every science course that they could throw at me until I got the equivalent of a biology major. And then I would go and knock on his door. And I did. I went in with sheets of courses. I figured if I have enough courses behind me, he'll never be able to turn me down. Well, of course, he did, because he said, you have to have a funded project. It's very nice that you've taken all these courses, but. So that was the next step, was to get the funded project, and then he accepted me as a graduate student. So that's the long and the short of it. But my message, I was a teacher for 25 years. And my message to kids is always, don't ever give up. You can always get what you want if you just keep working hard enough. And don't be scared of science. You can do it, but you got to know why you're doing it. Because otherwise it's a lot of numbers and equations and funny things that you may not be able to relate to anything that you know at that point. So, yeah. Yes?
I'm interested to know, why is it called
Hacking?
Where did that word come from?
You know, it's funny you ask that, because I just found that out about 2 weeks ago. I had never really thought about where it came from. It came from falconry. It's a falconry term for taking the young birds out of the nest, and then they would take them and basically either raise them, or they would raise them in captivity, and they would breed them in captivity and then raise them to hunt with. But the hacking the hack was a wagon that falconers used to use in the old days when they went up to the nest and they'd scale up into the cliffs to get the falcons out, the baby falcons out of the nest, they would carry them back in this wagon that was called a hack. And if you know anything about horses or riding, oftentimes you refer to a horse as a hack. It's a really good hack, which means they're really easy to ride and they're really comfortable and gentle. And it must have come somehow from that the hacks would have pulled the wagons or something. But anyway, I didn't even know that. So it's a really good question. Yeah.
No, actually, I have to speak up some.
No, please do. I've got the expert here in the audience.
But the hacking goes back to the medieval times, and they used to, it was especially with peregrines, they wanted them to have some experience in the wild. So they put them up in a tower and feed them unseen by the birds.
Right.
And the birds would start dispersing. And the deal was you had to catch them before they went off hunting by themselves, you know. But they get this exercise. People still do it now, and keep bringing birds back because they're better than a bird raised in captivity.
Right.
But you know, Tom Cade turned it around so that he wanted them to disperse.
Yeah. So it was a little bit different that way.
Right. Instead of catching them right at the last minute.
So we just took that technique and applied it to eagles and figured out what the differences were between the two species. And there were differences. So you had to treat them a little bit, you know, different. And we had to figure out what those were in order to be able to adapt it, to adapt the hacking to the bald eagles. But in terms of the word itself, I think that was the wagon.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Anyway, any other questions? Yes.
You said that before ladder you could climb up those metal pole things.
I'm
Did you ever fall down?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
The metal pole that you had to climb up.
Oh, did I ever fall? No, I didn't. It was amazing. I didn't ever fall. People have always asked me, why didn't you wear a harness? And I thought, that was never mentioned. That was not even a possibility that I could wear a harness. Maybe I would have thought differently about it if I'd known that. No, it's funny because I was terrified of heights. And terrified. I mean, I couldn't go up a tree. I had 4 brothers and I couldn't climb trees with them. They would climb and I would be at the bottom. So my first revelation that I actually had to climb in this job was when Jim Weaver and I went up to build a nest on the platform. And he, scampered up these little metal things and got to the top and then turned around and said, okay, come on up. And I looked up 35 feet in the air, and he was standing there looking down at me, and I thought, this is it. If I tell him that I'm terrified of heights, this will be the end of my eagle career. I won't be able to do this project. So I knew I had to quickly overcome whatever I was feeling, and slowly but surely I got up to that platform. And it's funny because I heard from Jim recently, and he said, he read the book, and he said, I had no idea that you were afraid of heights. So I said, yes, I did it. I was sure that he must have known, and he was just being kind, but apparently he didn't figure it out. But no, I never did fall, thank God, but I was very careful. I was careful. Yes?
Tina, were there ever people that said this is not going to work?
Oh, yeah. Most people said that wasn't going to work.
Talk about naysayers?
It was funny because people, not the Peregrine team, they never thought that it wasn't going to work. They figured if it works with peregrines, it'll work with eagles. We just have to figure it out. So it was all just like a puzzle, especially to Jim, who really had he was the one who made all the decisions. I just followed along and said, oh, okay, I'll do that. But I think he always believed that it would work. It was just a matter of, figuring it out. But yeah, there were a lot of people. The government wasn't sure it was going to work, and they were putting money into it, but they didn't want to put too much more into it. That's why I started with 2 birds, and we only went to the 4 the following year once I'd proven that they'd left the refuge and they'd been eating. That was a big thing, that I saw them eating, because nobody was sure whether eagles were actually able to find food on their own without their parents. It had never been looked at before. So people thought maybe they require the parents to show them how to fish. As it turned out, they didn't. They were perfectly fine finding the fish by themselves. So there were a lot of things we just didn't know. And so, but I think that, I think the government wasn't absolutely positive it was going to work, the government people. But then they were happily surprised when it did. So it was really good. And I wasn't completely convinced it was going to work because I felt like this is all on me. I'm the one who's going to be calling Washington. They're not going to be calling Washington. When I lose the bird in the marsh and I can't find him, that was my greatest fear, was finding him in the middle of the cattails and being able to rescue him and bring him back up to the tower and let him start all over. And then, of course, he'd go right back down again. And it was all the time. I mean, 2 or 3 times a day I was rescuing him from the cattails. And I just figured, there's one of those times I'm not going to find that bird. And I figured he wasn't going to make it if I couldn't find him. So I was very worried. But, yeah. Anyway, it all worked out. Thank goodness. Yes.
That part of the procedure of searching for the bird after it didn't fly, you did that, or people did continue to do that, or did they work something else out?
They sort of worked something else out. First of all, they kept them in a lot longer, and they didn't really let them go until they were absolutely ready to be able to get some lift and get into a tree. There were also a lot of them on the job, so there were a lot more people around. When New York State took it over, it wasn't usually just one person when the birds were flying. It was usually 2 or 3 people were watching them, so if somebody could watch where they were going, and then they could pick them up. But a lot of it was just containing them for longer. I mean, that was something we didn't know. You know, we didn't realize because we wanted to do what the parents were doing, and the parents, when they started flapping around, you know, they were in a big tree, so they had branches that they could go out to and flap their wings and get some exercise, and then they'd sometimes drop down to a lower branch. But the parents were there the whole time. If that eagle fell to the ground, usually he was right below the tree, and the parents would just take care of him. So when I did it, I wasn't anywhere near them. They were way down in the marsh. If you can imagine, those of you who've been to Montezuma and know where that marsh is, if you look up on the hill, way up, that's where I was. So I couldn't even get to them from there. I had to get in my Jeep and go all the way around the outskirts of the refuge and come in and then try to figure out where in that pool was this eagle. And I had the radio, you know, I had the bunny ear thing that you go beep, 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 and then all of a sudden you hear the beeps are getting louder. Oh, yeah, I know he's right around the corner, and there he'd be sitting all bedraggled in the middle of a pool, soaking wet, and there was no way that eagle was going to get out of there. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that was the most exciting part.
So you just grab them and put them in one of your pant legs?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what I did. At first I put a blanket over him. I had this small blanket so he couldn't see me. And that worked really. I knew enough about parakeets to know that that helps. So I put the blanket over him. He couldn't see where I was. And then I put him into the sleeve. And then I wrapped the electrical tape around him and put him under my arm like a football. And we walked back through the marsh, which was quite a long time because it was a very deep water and sometimes they were in the middle of the marsh. I'd get back to my Jeep. I'd put him down in the front seat next to me. And he would clack, 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 clack the whole time, all the way back up to the tower. And then I'd climb back up the tower with him and put him down and give him a big lecture. Do not do this again until you're ready. When your wings are stronger, you can leave. And then I'm climbing with one hand with the eagle under me like this. Yeah.
And you're afraid of heights.
And I was, well, by then, I'd pretty much gotten over my fear of heights. Yeah. Now I could climb anything. I had to go up and down that ladder a lot. Yes, Alyssa.
Tina, did you ever, was it ever thought to build like a tree house in a really tall tree instead so that they could go from branch to branch as they were fishing rather than this artificial platform?
Rather than the artificial platform? No. That was never considered. But it's a really good question, and I think the reason it wasn't considered is it would have been difficult to manipulate around it. climbing up all that time, and also building. It was a pretty big structure. You could see by the pictures. By the time we were done, because I had to have a blind big enough for me to fit in, and then they had to have the platform big enough for them to be in, and when the Ford came, then there were 2 platforms on either side of the blind. So the V in those trees aren't going to be big enough to be able to fit a tree house that's that large. And it would have been tough to get up and down, I think. It could have been done. I think it wouldn't have probably been as easy to build, and we were sort of pressed for time. We were basically watching the Wisconsin climbers ready for that phone call, so that nest had to go together really quickly because nobody knew exactly when they were going to be the right age. You know, we didn't know that much about their breeding cycle and when they were going to be hitting 7 weeks. As it turned out, they were older than 7 weeks by the time the climbers got them. And the first year, the climbers took 2 that were in the same nest, which they weren't supposed to do. So that was a mistake. Or it wasn't a mistake, I think they did it on purpose, but we didn't know they were doing that. So we didn't know that those birds were siblings. So that was kind of an interesting, so it's not a perfect science. I guess that's what we sort of learned. It's really, you know, trial and error.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
And there's a hand up there that's been just like, please, please call me.
Which one?
Right there with the long dark hair.
Oh, okay.
So you said you had to go and rescue them a lot when they started flying. How did you know when they were going to be okay and you didn't have to go rescue them? How did you know when they were flying?
How did I know when they were going to fly?
Okay.
Yeah, when they were okay and you didn't have to keep rescuing them.
Oh, okay. The only time I knew they were okay was when they flew out of the refuge and they came back for their food. And then I figured that they were going to be okay because they knew that there was going to be food there. And I really knew they were going to be okay when I saw them catch their own fish. Now, the second year, I never saw them catch a fish. I had a feeling they were doing it because they stopped coming back to the tower for food. So they were getting food from somewhere. But I have to admit, the only time we really knew they were okay was when the 1976 male bird came back in 1977. He came back to the refuge and was visiting with the 77 birds in the marsh. And I was sitting there with my binoculars looking at the 77 birds, and suddenly I'm looking at a bird that has a different tag on it. And I said, oh my gosh, that's W2. And he's come back, and that was a year later, which means he'd survived for the year. And that was probably the most dramatic moment for me because it showed that he had been able to find food and survive and miss all the threats that were in front of him for the past year. So that was really exciting. Yeah.
Tina, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you.